Thank you. 2 years ago, I began an experiment that I will not survive to see through to the finish. In the city of Berlin, I released 100 cameras, each of which has a 100-year-long exposure. The cameras are very simple, necessarily so, and cheap to make. They are pinhole cameras that, instead of using film, which would obviously spoil rather quickly, use ordinary black paper, which, as I'm sure you all know from experience, if you leave it out, it will fade in sunlight. And so essentially what is happening is that you have a pinhole that's projecting an image onto the paper and fading the image that is being projected very, very gradually. And one of the things that's curious about this to me is that when you place one of these cameras somewhere out in the wild, you are not only getting an image of an object, of a building, for instance. In fact, what you're getting is an image of change over time. If you think about a basketball game, for instance, where you'll see a player moving very quickly, almost a ghost against a background where the court is very strongly and boldly in focus, you get an idea of what might happen over 100 years, where a building is torn down after 20 and another one goes up in its place and remains there for the remaining 80 years. And therefore, in the image, you have the entire process, the entire story. And so these were the cameras that I offered with a deal that I made to anyone who wanted one. They were to give me a deposit of 10 euros and to take a camera and hide it somewhere in Berlin, tell nobody where it was, including me. And as they got to be very old, or within their will, they were to reveal to a child where the camera had been hidden. And the child would then take responsibility for it, so that in the year 2114, the child will be responsible for retrieving the camera and bringing it back to the alternative gallery where I started the project, a gallery called Team Titanic. And there will be an exhibition of these 100 or 10 or 1 or none of the images that eventually come in. I thought of these cameras and talked about them quite a lot within the media as an essential part of the process and of the project, because while their actual location is unknown, it seemed really important to me that people know that they're out there. And what I talked about was that they were surveillance cameras in the hands of those not yet born, that were watching us, watching the city and watching everyone in it as they went about their business, and in a sense would be a means by which to provide a sort of a paranoia, perhaps, or at least some sort of sense of responsibility through the fact that you're being watched, and what you do, the choices that you make, ultimately are going to be revealed, not in terms of any individual image of you, but in terms of how the city changes as a whole. And so these cameras were released out into the city, and as I said, I have no idea where they've gone, and they will become something potentially interesting to urban planners a century from now, but I think they are actually going to be more interesting in the short term for us, who are able to imagine what is happening within the camera, knowing that it's there, and therefore being able to see out 100 years in the future by imagining what in 100 years might potentially be shown. So naturally, when you start with 100, if you're using a base 10 system, you end up getting ambitious and you want to go for 1,000. And that is what happened to me in 2015. I realized that the camera that I could make would probably not look like this. A tin would probably not last, and the paper would probably get soggy. And so instead, I went for something that was, I won't call it higher tech. It might in fact be lower tech, because what I did was I looked to sources such as archaeology and art history to help me to figure out what sort of an object, what sort of capsule might last, that might be able to provide some sort of image, if everything goes well, over a period of a millennium. And so what that meant was making it out of copper, a material that is known very well to take on a patina that becomes protective in a way that the camera ultimately will effectively stop aging after a certain number of years as it takes on that crust of age. And yet, of course, that isn't so good for the pinhole, which is the same as the pinhole in the 100-year camera, but in this case, the aperture is pierced through 24-karat gold. And then there is the emulsion. In that case, I look to the Renaissance, to Renaissance oil painting techniques, and to the fact that we know on the one hand that they are incredibly stable, painting on copper using a technique that involves rubbing garlic into the metal and various other arcane processes. We know that that will last, and at the same time we know that the image is fugitive. That is to say that from art conservation studies, we know very well that what tends to happen is that the paintings in museums will fade, and that's what we want in this case. It actually is a good thing. And so what I did was I used a certain oil paint, which was painted on the back, and started to take some pictures. In this case, looking at 1,000 years rather than 100, it's a rather different sort of a proposition. It's not really about urban planning in your neighborhood. It's a much grander view of the city and how the city changes over time, or how nature does so. And so there are two of these cameras that I have since installed, one of which is overlooking the lovely Tempe skyline built into the Arizona State University Art Museum, and a second one is looking out on a more natural landscape, the Holyoke Range in Massachusetts, built into a steeple at Amherst College. And these cameras will, well, probably they won't work. There are so many reasons why, and we would be here all day if I were to start to enumerate them, but you can imagine all the reasons why they might not, and yet at the same time, they could. And I think that there is something really interesting to me about what happens when you place one of these cameras out in the world and make it into, in this case, a public sort of a space in which people can see the camera, look out on the landscape, see that far future through the eyes of those who might see that camera, open it up 1,000 years from now, and therefore be able to have this sort of binocular vision through time. This vision looking out into the future and back upon our own time from the standpoint of the future in ways that might inform, for instance, how we go about building more sustainable cities, and also how we go about the broader problems that are inherent in how we deal with carbon and how we handle the climate. A sense of responsibility once again, but here it really becomes global. So where do we go from here? Well, it happens to be that, as Barry alluded to a few minutes ago, simultaneous with these two projects, I was writing a book that coincidentally has just been released this week, which is called You Belong to the Universe, and is about Buckminster Fuller, a theme of this conference, looking at his ideas and thinking about how those ideas built up in his own time, what impact they had, and what impact they might have in the future, and how we might apply them, how we might reconsider them in our own time. And there are many very obvious sorts of inventions that I write about in the book, such as his three-wheel Dymaxion car. But the one that really strikes me above all in certain ways is one that was addressed, at least in brief this morning, which is not so well known, and that is the geoscope. The geoscope originated as a process that Fuller undertook during World War II, working for the US government, where he had a globe and was responsible for figuring out logistics, figuring out how to get materials from one place to another in terms of use of the Navy. And so what he did was he had a bowl that he was able to place over the globe and to draw lines that were what are referred to as great circles. And those circles were shipping routes, but also what happened was, as he looked at it, he realized that they were polygons that might be the basis for unfolding the globe and creating a new kind of map, what became the Dymaxion world map, which was an equal area projection map that avoided a lot of the problems of distortion that had been the case in many maps that preceded it. But he also had another thought while looking at this globe and all the lines inscribed on it, and that was, what if the lines were made out of metal? Great circles are also known as geodesics, and you can guess what I'm therefore talking about. The geodesic dome was a result of his explorations of logistics, and it was a structure, of course, that has gone around the world from everything from a trade pavilion to hippie housing. And yet at the same time, it also ended up getting used in a curious way, an unexpected way that makes perfect sense when you realize what its origin was. And that is to say, he started to put continents onto it in a sort of a mesh that would allow you to get inside of it, looking out, and to have the experience of being in an outdoor planetarium at night, being able to see the stars relative to the continents, and to get a real sense of the entire planet. So to this, he started to add what he called data planes, ways in which to be able to see what you could not ordinarily, such as the distribution of minerals in Earth's crust. And that led to, as tends to be the case with everything that Fuller did, more and more grandiose ideas. You could make it so that it was totally computerized. You could have it so that it would have a system of lights, and it became ultimately something that was proposed to the United Nations, that this would be a 200-foot sphere that would be put over the East River in view of the UN World Headquarters, where people inside would be able to see patterns that otherwise would be invisible, but that were absolutely essential, all gleaned from a worldwide network of sensors, everything from patterns to do with energy usage to patterns to do with military buildups and human migration. Well, needless to say, if you've ever been to New York, you will know it never happened. It cost way too much money. It was in the, I think he quoted $10 million in his optimistic way. And also there was the inherent problem in so much of what Fuller came up with that was very much true with this project, that it was something that probably could not have been done in his time. The networks were not in place, nor were the sensors. Well, they are today in a way that we're all very familiar with by way of the World Wide Web. And so suddenly it becomes possible to do what he envisioned. And also, I believe it has become much more important, much more necessary to do so, not only for the relatively obvious reason that the world's resources are even more imperiled and that patterns are ever more complex, the sheer complexity of how we interact in modern society, but also because it seems to me that we have access to all of this data, or a lot of it, and we have access to it in ways that are beautifully visualized in many cases. But unfortunately, we all live within our own focus bubble, as it's sometimes called. That is to say, we all are seeing what we want to see instead of having that sort of global vision, the presence that you might have with a geoscope. And yet I think that there's something that is inherently flawed about having one geoscope in Manhattan that is something that is seen only by the privileged few who happen to be there, by the world's leaders. And instead, I think that given the possibilities of technology today, that we can start thinking about a geoscope at a much smaller, more modest scale, as a monument, but a small one, in cities all over the country and all over the world. I envision it being something that might be situated within a data park. So to take the example of San Francisco, a data park would essentially be the city in miniature that would have the same contours, the same hills and valleys, and would be a means by which you could project from above using projectors that would be mounted on pillars, projecting what was happening in the city, both immediately in terms of microclimates and also more broadly in terms of patterns of gentrification. And that this could be simultaneous with what was being seen globally on the geoscope, that you would be able to start to make these correspondences within your city of what was happening worldwide and what was happening happening locally, and that would allow you to start to operate because this would be a sort of a civic space, a data commons, literally, a place where people could come together. It would allow for a sort of confluence of conversation and confluence of interests. Well, quite frankly, I have no idea how to do it, technically speaking. I have a soldering iron at home, but I don't really have the coding skills and various other things such as a park in which to build it. And that is one reason why I mention it to you here today, in case any of you might want to get involved in this project, because I do think that it is feasible in San Francisco and becomes potentially something that can happen elsewhere if only we get the right civic and technological backing for it. But I mention it also because I want to come back around to what I was speaking of earlier, which is to say that I think that data visualization is absolutely essential in our world in order to be able to see and make sense of patterns. But I would argue that it is equally important that we cultivate what I would call data imagination. That is to say, the ability not only to see things as represented by somebody interpreting what is happening in the world, but the ability to conjure in your mind what might not be visible because it hasn't yet happened. And that is where what I was speaking about earlier, the idea of deep time photography potentially comes in as something to supplement the geoscope, as a second area, a second level of engagement with our cities and with the natural environment. And so I'm also putting out to you another idea. This is all open source, and of course I've done it all wrong in the first few prototypes, and it will take tens of thousands of years to get it right, but with more people involved, we might be able to get there faster as well. What I would propose is that we have, in every city, in every town, one of these Millennium cameras, someplace public, someplace that's central to the town where everybody is able to see it and to engage in it. And that these also be in places such as the rainforests and also Antarctica, that they be not only places that we necessarily go, but places that we don't, where we are aware because of the global way in which what we do affects everything around us, that too is being watched, and that there's a way in which this far future is watching us, and we are able to see ourselves through their eyes. But I think it also has to be more participatory. That is to say that I think that the Century Camera project in Berlin can become a model for another aspect of this vision. That is to say that probably making them out of tin is not a great idea, too expensive and all the rest, but I think that there's an even easier and cheaper way of going about it, namely out of cardboard. I made this as a model that was a part of the exhibition at Amherst College, and people actually made them, and in Western Massachusetts, there probably are a few sad examples of this camera, which essentially you cut out, glue, poke a hole in, and then you put it out in the world. There probably are examples out there that are getting rained upon, and frankly, we printed a couple hundred of them. I would be surprised if I were alive to be surprised if any of them survived. They won't. But once we start getting into big numbers, things change. So what I am envisioning is that this, or something like it, become a birthright. That every child throughout the world be given one of these cameras to make and to place and then to go through the exercise without the 10-euro deposit, but nevertheless with the rest intact, to put it someplace that they deem to be important to them, looking out on something that they want either to preserve or to change, and therefore to engage them in the process of stasis and of change, but also to provide this sort of global, pervasive surveillance, the worst thing I can possibly imagine, except when it gets into this sort of role where it's working for the next generation, and where what happens is that these cameras are coming in every day, starting 100 years from now, and also are going out into the world, and it becomes a process that becomes not only a mechanism for data imagination, but also for us to be able to interact with it, to see that data in place, because it can become part of the fabric of the geoscope itself, of these data parks, of these local and global visualizations, that becomes a way in which we are able to enter into this very Fuller-esque way in which we can see the entire world in spatial terms, but we can also start to see through time and to place ourselves within space and time in ways that can build a greater sense of responsibility and that can make us better, more significant, and yet more responsible citizens in our future world society. I will leave you with that, and I thank you very much for your time.